you guys are okay with that. So it is recording now. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present. Let's see my Google Slides here. Do you guys see that on the screen? On your screen, I should say. Somebody?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Fantastic. All right. This is a little different for me because I'm used to putting people to sleep in class, so I can see actually people like falling asleep. So here I'm just assuming everybody's asleep. All right. So this isn't going to take us the full 30 minutes. It's a relatively short kind of introduction to the chapter on that. So what you should see here is our title slide. Excuse me. And so I'm always going to have kind of when we do these presentations, and sometimes we'll have like two-parters. Like next week we'll have a two-parter, but when we do part one of a two-parter, or if we just do one that's just one part, I'll always have the chapter title and the kind of the era that it's talking about. So the title of chapter 1 is First Humans, and usually they give dates, right? The kind of a time frame here. So prehistory to 3500 BC. Now this is something I'll be kind of stressing quite a bit with dates here. And if most of you guys who are seniors probably took U.S. history last year, you probably didn't deal with a lot of this. But in world history, because it's covering larger time frame, we will use the terms BC and AD frequently. You'll see in worksheets or notes or stuff like that. BC stands for before Christ. All right, so it's a very kind of Christian-centric model of dating historical events. All right, and so when they say 3500 BC, that means 3,500 years before the birth of Jesus. AD is the other one, which a lot of people believe stands for after death. It's a Latin term, Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord. So it's basically connotating the year that Jesus was born. Now, this was not always exact. The actual kind of like classification on that doesn't really start until probably the 16th century with the Catholic Church kind of establishing that. All right. Now, in some worksheets that we'll have that aren't kind of pertaining to the textbook, because the textbook still uses BC and AD, you'll see BCE and CE. BCE, which stands for Before Common Era, is essentially kind of replaces BC, and CE stands for Common Era, which replaces AD. So in some worksheets, you may see that. That's a little bit more of a PC way to kind of date kind of events, but we'll stay with BC and AD. So the one thing is with BC is that it essentially counts down. So an event that occurred in 3500 BC is older than an event that, let's say, occurred in 1700 BC. All right. With AD, it counts up. All right. So an event that occurred in, let's say, 1920 is older or occurred before an event that occurred in 2020. All right. And so technically our year is AD 2020, which is 2020 years before the birth of Jesus, supposedly. All right. So I'll give you guys a handout notes where you don't have to write anything, but I'll just give you the information on chronological terms. Like BC and AD. All right. So in here, like I said, it's kind of like this kind of first chapter is mainly dealing with what we call prehistory. All right. Now, when you guys signed up, you didn't sign up for a prehistory class. All right. However, there's a distinction between prehistory and history. All right. So here's your first definition. Prehistory, the thing that separates prehistory and history, which prehistory is the study of the past prior to development of written records. History is the study of the past based on written records, is the evidence of writing. Analyzing events in the past, all right, based on writing is history. So last year when you guys took U.S. history, some of you guys may have had AP U.S. history or whatever you guys talked about, the American Revolution. You were able to know what the founding fathers had in mind when they separated from England with the Declaration of Independence because they wrote it down. All right. Or you may have understood the kind of the intention of the Emancipation Proclamation. All right. Or the Marshall Plan. All right. It says it was written down. All right. So we have a little bit of a fuller story, if you will. However, that does not mean that history cannot be manipulated and is always accurate. In many cases, history is the kind of the story by those who were the conquerors, if you will. All right. And so in many cases, like for example, in let's say thousands of years from now, people are analyzing the history of the kind of the term of Barack Obama, President Obama. And all the evidence that they got was from, let's say, Fox News. They would believe that Barack Obama was Satan incarnate. Now, if they got the kind of basically they were getting the history on the presidency of George W. Bush, and all they got was the information from, let's say, MSNBC, they would think that he was Satan incarnate. So it can be manipulated, right? However, it does tell a little bit more of a story. Prehistory is a little bit more complicated. All right. Kind of while you guys had written kind of evidence on that assignment that I gave you guys with the kind of the 8 kind of statements that you had to kind of rearrange, you were given limited information. All right. And so you were able to kind of take that limited information and formulate a story. Right. Now, in many cases, the stories were pretty close to what the actual story was in terms of, let's say, like the Iceman weighing 110 pounds. But other ones, when you said like the rucksack weighed 110 pounds, that also made sense. All right. So in a case here, prehistory doesn't always give us a complete accurate story, and it changes over time. This chapter is actually outdated, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the whole concept of the concept of evolution here. All right. So the one thing, particularly when we're talking about prehistory here, is that we don't have, let's say, in the story of the Iceman, we don't have his journals or anything. He doesn't have a journal, right? So we don't know, what happened to him per se in that sense. He doesn't like write a journal. It's like, ouch, I got shot in the back, all right, with an arrow. All right. What they have to work on, those who are dealing with like kind of prehistory, are primarily 2 classifications: fossils and artifacts, which these are things you probably had in grade schools. Fossils are remains of living organisms. Obviously, the most famous thing being bones, right? I remember when my kids were little, they're fascinated by dinosaurs, right? And so that includes bones, remains. So like in the story of the Iceman, obviously a fossil remain would be his body himself, right? But also living organisms as well. Like you can anything plant based, anything that was kind of living, that would be classified as an organism. All right. Then the other thing is artifacts. All right. These were objects that are basically kind of shaped by people. So objects once made and used by people in the past that can tell a story in a bigger sense. All right. So in the story of the Iceman, right, the artifacts that he left behind would maybe be his fur coat, his rucksack, the bow and arrow and such like that. All right. So like when he has a bow, like what's he using that for? Probably for hunting. Right. So they got an idea that he was probably somebody who was a hunter, maybe. All right. Obviously, they have his coat. Obviously, he was kind of like dealing with the elements to try to stay warm. I can tell you that. So the artifacts will give you a little bit of insight. All right, but they may not always tell the full story, if you will. So these are the things that essentially those who are studying prehistory are mainly dealing with. Am I moving too fast? Are you guys doing okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, thanks. I just need some clarification here. All right. So an example, obviously, this is an example of fossil remains. All right. This was a tomb that was uncovered. I believe this was in South America. All right. And then artifacts would be like kind of like this. All right. These were items that were found in the American Southwest. All right, from a native population that lived around 1000 AD 1000. So from the story, you can tell that they were basically engaged in agriculture. There was some weaponry maybe used for hunting and that. Also, too, this is like kind of a primitive axe or days. So obviously with the kind of the use of kind of like the seeds and stuff like that, they would use that probably for farming. All right. Also here, this item right here is called the chunky stone. And you found these actually we have a large, just like right in our backyard at Cahokia Mounds, a large site of prehistory right there. All right. And at Cahokia, they found these kind of like disc kind of items there, and they found them in other native population centers that probably they were used like lawn bowling, if you will. All right, so this civilization probably had was advanced enough where they could also engage in leisure activity. All right, they found evidence of what we would classify dice at Cahokia, if you will. All right, so these artifacts kind of tell a story of this culture here. All right, that had engaged in agriculture, systematic. And when they engage in agriculture, they tend to stay in places a longer period of time. Roughly around the same time in 1000, these are artifacts that were discovered in what is Ireland. All right, and so you can tell that this civilization is a little bit different in the sense that their use of their tools and weapons that are you have more use of metals. So they were an Iron Age culture. All right, and so like kind of like using kind of for cups and things of that nature. Also, too, this is probably around what was considered an old Viking settlement. And up here, this is kind of a misconception. The Vikings kind of wore like kind of horned helmets. They were probably more used in kind of like religious ceremonies. All right. And so also the evidence of a kind of belief system kind of engages this a little bit more advanced civilization, advanced culture. So these are roughly found at the same time in different parts of the world, and they can tell two different stories. All right. Now, those who are primarily dealing with fossils and artifacts generally fall into two camps. Archaeologists, who are mainly studying the fossil remains, you know, like the more famous ones being the paleo archaeologists, the ones who are they're the ones who are like fossil remains, right? But that story can even change over time. The whole story of the Brontosaurus is actually, I believe, it's actually two separate dinosaur fossil remains. And then anthropologists who take artifacts in many cases and kind of fill in the blanks. You guys in the story of the Iceman were doing more anthropology, if you will. All right, so you were basically given a limited information. You're kind of organizing it into a story. And again, you had a hypothesis. In many cases, people had different stories based on kind of like, you know, their different conclusions. There are different conclusions based on their different stories. So you guys were doing more anthropology. All right, and you're trying to come up, and everybody was kind of like developing, while you may not have had the story exact, you were developing a logical kind of explanation or logical conclusion, if you will. All right, so again, archaeologists primarily deal with fossil remains. Anthropologists deal with a little bit more. They try to fill in the blanks. They try to kind of analyze what the kind of artifacts were used for, try to analyze what these kind of like cultures and civilizations had their structure, straight from social structure to kind of governmental, religious, all that stuff. All right. Now, I was going to show you guys this video on like particularly when it comes to like dating artifacts and fossil remains, all right, but it won't play because I'm on Google Slides and this was initially made in a PowerPoint. But what this video was talking about was essentially something you're probably familiar with if you took a biology class, and that's the kind of the concept of carbon dating, radiocarbon dating, or what it calls C14. So this was developed in the late 1940s at the University of Chicago. A guy named Willard Libby, who was also worked on the Manhattan Project, developing the atomic bomb, was working at the University of Chicago and determined that every living organism has carbon-14 in them. All right, this goes from us to plants and things of that nature. All right, and so when a living organism ceases to exist, the carbon-14 starts to decay. All right. So if something has less carbon-14 in it, the lower the carbon-14, the older the artifact or fossil remains. So it's believed they can date like our organic material up to about 50,000 years old. The first thing that they used to date that, to use radiocarbon dating, was a boat that they found in Egypt. And that they believed, after they kind of extracted a piece of wood from that ship, that it existed probably around like 1500 BC or so, like during what we call, or between 1700 and 1500 BC, what they would call the New Kingdom era there. All right. Now, the video was going to show you, they determined the date of a mummy that was found in South America, in Peru, by a culture called the Cheribaya, who kind of predate the Inca. And they actually dated a coca leaf that she was buried with, and determined that she lived anywhere between 1300 and 1400. AD. Now, they were given in a kind of a 100-year time frame there, but the story is not complete in that case. So let's say, for example, let's say in 1,000 years, somebody finds your remains, and they determined that based on the items that they had, that you lived between 1920 and 2020. All right. Now, that's not going to give you, like, basically really give you a true story of who you were. All right. Because if they have it you living closer to 1920, the years between 1920 and 2020, which while both years have pandemics, ironically, are greatly different, right, based on technology and things of that nature. So it doesn't always tell a complete story, but it gets us kind of close to that. All right. And so here's just kind of a graphic. I'll show you guys throughout the course. I'm going to show you guys maps, graphs, and charts to kind of stress the kind of things that we're talking about. I watch CMTVs, so I know the young adults are into a few things. 1, trap music. 2, chocolate milk. 3, chewing gum. And 4, maps, graphs, and charts. The first 3 I can't provide for you, but the last ones I give you all day, every day. So this is a fossil, which basically, because they show through kind of a machine that separates the stable kind of C12 from the unstable carbon-14. All right, and like I said, the less carbon-14 that is in a fossil or artifact, the older it is. All right. However, in this chapter, a lot of the stuff that we kind of determined how old remains are, particularly when we talk about the kind of concept of human evolution, is going to use a system referred to as potassium argon dating, which a lot of stuff is using kind of geologic material, rocks and things of that nature that surrounds them. All right, a lot of these fossil remains. So, for example, the Grand Canyon, they use the potassium argon dating method to determine the age of the Grand Canyon. All right, so this could date material much, much older. Like I said, it isn't always, so you're not always going to get it exact. It's going to give you a relative time frame to that. All right, but like when we talk about the concept of evolution, there was a series of footprints that they were able to date that dated back to the time of a kind of classification of human species called Homo habilis. All right, and we'll talk about that next week there. All right, so that should be the last thing in notes here. I was going to show you a video on the Iceman himself. I'll see if I can post it on Google Classroom. It just won't play in the presentation here. But just to give you an idea, we're talking about the Iceman. This is what he looked like when they discovered him in 91. Kind of frozen in the ice there. All right, he kind of looks a little bit like baked chicken, a little bit. But he's in a museum. He's at a university in Austria. Matter of fact, Austria and Italy had a dispute on actually where he was discovered. It was determined he was in Austria. And they had, in the video, they were basically 2 anthropologists and archaeologists kind of recreated his steps and the items. They kind of recreated the items that he was found with. And there was a theory initially that he was a shepherd. They was in the mountains. He maybe been killed for his sheep. However, one of the anthropologists actually walked up the kind of the area where he was at using what was they found was kind of his shoes, and determined his shoes were not conducive to basically being a shepherd in the mountains at the time. So they believe, the theory is, I'm not totally sure, they believe that he was probably ostracized from a small group and was murdered, was shot in the back with an arrow. Now, why, we'll never know, because, again, with prehistory, he didn't leave behind a journal. All right, he didn't leave behind written records, all right, to give us a little bit more of an insight. Okay, so I'll try to find that video. So do you guys, how was this? Were you guys okay with this? I mean, it was boring, but on the scale of boring, hopefully it was closer to like 1 than 10.
It was good enough.
Good enough. Okay, that's all I'm asking. Did you guys get the information?
Yep.
Everybody get the information. So make sure you send it back. Send it back as a grade so I can send it back to you. And I will post this. On Google Classroom if you want to go back. If you want to go back to it. So let's try to see. All right, there I am. Okay. All right. So what the plan is I'm not going to send you guys out anything tomorrow. You guys got an early weekend. Monday, I'm going to send out a worksheet that's going to kind of introduce us into the next section, which is talking about the concept of human evolution. All right. And then on Tuesday, we'll do our second thing in notes on section 2. All right, which that will take us Tuesday, and then we'll do the second half on Thursday. All right. So you guys got that?
Yeah, there's 2 things to turn in, but they're the same thing. Do you want us to just make a copy and turn it in?
Oh, you know what? Just do one. I'm sorry, it must have duplicated that.
Okay.
Just do one, because when you turn it in, I'll send it back to you, and you'll have it for the test. Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what I
turned it in as a copy already, but is that okay? I
Yeah,
can
that's
unsubmit it, but
No, you're good. That's fine. That's all good. Yeah,
Okay,
I just want to make sure
alright.
you guys, you turn in, I give you a grade, and then you have it. So when you take the test, you'll have it for the test.
okay.
Okay, sound good? All right, guys. Well, thanks for being patient with me as I try to deal with technology. Grandpa here is just trying to figure out the VCR. So I will post this on Google Classroom. All right. And I'll try to get grades in by tomorrow so you have an idea on Skyward on where you stand. Okay.
All righty.
All right, guys. Have a good weekend.
You too.
All right. Have a good
Bye.
weekend.
You
Bye.
too. Take care.
You too.
Bye.